Welcome to Buddhist View podcast. Welcome, Andy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So, I will add some timestamps for anybody who's interested in a particular topic in this video. And mostly, Andy has done a lot of research about Beyul and the relationship between Buddhism and Islam. So, we'll have a little bit of a free conversation here. But maybe first, you can tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe how you met the Dharma and how you found out about Beyul.
Sure. Let's start the story. My name's Andy Hallahan. I'm a research affiliate at Rigdzin Institute. That's where you and I met. That's where I did my master's degree at RYI in Nepal. So I came to Nepal first in 2016 to start studying Tibetan because my original interest was cognitive science, understanding of Vajrayana deity yoga and like how visualization patterns can influence the mind. So first started studying classical Tibetan, but at some point in my degree, I kind of shifted gears into doing field work here in Nepal. So I studied more Nepali language, and I became very interested in the intersection of environmental conservation and this idea of the hidden lands in Tibetan Buddhism called Beyul, as you said before. So in 2020, just before the start of the pandemic in January, I made my way up to Langtang from Kathmandu. So I walked to Langtang from Kathmandu. It's about 110 kilometers, sorry. Takes about 4 or 5 days to get there from Kathmandu by foot. It's a really nice walk. I recommend it to everyone if you want to walk through Nepal.
Which direction did you go?
Just directly north. So over Shivapuri Nagarjun, you walk past villages, like kind of down in the Nuwakot Valley there. I don't think you call it the Nuwakot Valley, but that kind of region there. And then up through Gosen Kunda Pass into Langtang, through Helambu or Yomo. Really nice walk, and you pass by lots of different gompas and villages, and people are really friendly around there. But anyway, so while doing my thesis research in Langtang Valley, so documenting sacred natural sites, interpreting one text that was written by the local lama up there who I was staying with. I was camping behind his house, stayed up there for several months, and then the COVID lockdown happened, and all foreigners left Langtang Valley, and most foreigners left Nepal entirely. But since I was up there in the Beyul, in the hidden land, which the prophecies say, in times of plague, seek refuge in the hidden land. And so I was like, oh, this is a plague. This is literally what the prophecies are talking about. So I'm just going to stay here. And Lamala was like, also, it's like, this is great. Like, just hang out with us. And at a certain point, I'd run out of money even. So I was working for the family. I was like washing their dishes and stuff like that, and like planting garlic and like digging holes behind their house. And then during the day I would go and like document the Mani stones and like take pictures here and there. And there's a really beautiful cave way high in the valley. It's where Mingyur Rinpoche finished his 4-year wandering retreat. It's near a place called Yak Podrang of the Yak Fortress up there.
Is that on the upper part of the valley?
It is, yeah. So it's about 2-3 hour walk past Kamjin Gumba, which is the last village up in Langtang Valley. And yeah, so I stayed in that cave for a couple nights, and it's pretty cold nights up there. But it's a nice cave. I always call it the Rolls Royce of Himalayan caves because it has like a nice bed there made with like pine needles, and that's where Rinpoche slept. I didn't sleep in that bed because I thought like, okay, it's like a kind of museum piece. Like, let's leave it that way. But in hindsight, I kind of wish I did. Anyway, yeah, so eventually it came to pass that while I was up in the valley, I needed to go back to Kathmandu, and I teamed up with this was in late April, so lockdown had been happening for about a full month, and I teamed up with a young Nepali guy who had just gotten out of medical school. And we decided we're going to avoid all the army checkpoints, and we're going to like stealthily just walk back to Kathmandu and just make our way there, because we had heard news that at any point the army's going to stop you. It's like full banda in Nepal, full lockdown, like nobody's going anywhere. And we were like, yeah, maybe we can fight because there's ways. There's always ways you can do stuff with Nepal. So we made our way up to Gosen Kunda, and we got just before the Gosen Kunda, and we encountered this sadhu, this Baba. His name was Om Das, and he was walking barefoot in knee-deep snow. And so, like, smoking chillum, like real sadhu style. And I was like, okay, this is a real sadhu. And he wouldn't say much. You'd ask him, how is he doing? And he would always respond with Om. And depending on his state of mind, that Om could be very excited or very sad. Like he's walking barefoot in the snow. I'm like, oh, Babaji, kasta chai. Om. So we called ourselves the Pandemic Patrol, or I called it the Pandemic Patrol with these two Holly blokes. And they're just, having a good time. But I learned a very valuable lesson from this Baba, from this sadhu. And he said that in Nepal, if you tell everybody the full truth, that they will respect you and they will trust you. And so his strategy was, no, we're not going to avoid the army. We're not going to avoid the police. We're going to go directly at them. And we're going to say Om Namah Shivaya when we get to the police and stuff like that. And so we did, and it worked. And the police were like, oh, Babaji, like so excited to see him. And they would give him like Roxy and stuff like that and be like, it's like, wow, okay. And so we managed to kind of get through checkpoints with the help of this Baba, because people in the villages, some people were scared. They would stick their head out of their window and they would just kind of be like, what is this foreigner doing? It was lockdown. Like, and the Baba, he would just explain the situation to them, and then people were okay with it, Anyway, so long story short, eventually get back to Kathmandu, write this whole thesis. So what is Beyul? So Beyul is a Tibetan word that literally translates as hidden land, but the notion of it, the idea of it, comes from the Shambhala mythology. So in case for those that are unfamiliar with the Shambhala mythology, in Western circles, it sometimes is referred to as Shangri-La, but this term Shangri-La is very much created by foreigners who were exposed to the Kalacakra Tantra and who were exposed to the Tibetan term Shambhala.
It comes from that movie, right?
It comes from a book called Lost Horizons, where they're describing the lost paradise city of Shangri-La. And this is the first time that we also see the English word and Shangri-La, the English word paradise, paired up with the Tibetan idea of Shangri-La and the Tibetan word Shambhala. The origins of the Shambhala mythology can be traced to the Kalacakra Tantra, envisioned as this kind of perfect Buddhist kingdom hidden away in the mountains, ruled by a philosopher king, for lack of a better term, and that this king also commands a very powerful army, and that this powerful army can be summoned forth to defend the true Dharma practitioners from invaders who would see the Dharma destroyed. And we can look at a number of different historical instances where that may have been on the mind of people who were performing the Kalacakra Tantra, and we have historical evidence that at certain times the Kalacakra Tantra was invoked to empower an army to win battles, particularly under Mongol patronage. So around the 13th and 14th centuries, you can see examples of that.
The Kalachakra is one of the latest or last tantras to be composed, right?
At least from a critical historical viewpoint, we would say that. But if we look at it from an insider viewpoint, from Buddhist doctrine, you might hear people say, well, it's always existed, and that it's existed since beginningless times, and that it's only been, rediscovered in the same sort of spirit that like Dharma treasure texts are rediscovered. They've been there since the beginning, but they've been sitting latent, idle, and they've just required, activation by an enlightened person. So that kind of brings to mind this element of enlightenment that is corresponding with Beyul. So Beyul, coming from the notion of Shambhala, has been described as several different Beyuls throughout the Himalayas. And the first instance of the word Beyul being used in Tibetan literature was from, at least to my knowledge, was Rigdzin Gödem. He's the founder of the Jangter school, the Northern Treasure School. And he is said to lay the keys to the 8 prominent Beyul, of which Langtang is one, Tsum Valley is another, Pemaku being the region around the bend of the Tsangpo River, Demoshong being Sikkim, and there are others as well. And so these keys were written in his text that he calls Neik, so like or Lamyik as well. guidebooks or like spiritual place guidebook.
Lonely Planet.
A Lonely Planet guide, but Nyingma is like different because it also gives ritual guidance of how to appease the protector deities that guard the gates of the Beyul. And so in these Lamyik and Nyingma, the Beyuls are described in mandalic positioning, a kind of square. So there's like a northern gate, a southern gate, an eastern gate, and a western gate. And they look different. They have different colors associated with them. They have different deities associated with them. And those deities are said to have been bound by Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, when he brought Buddhism to Tibet, he traveled through the Himalayas to bring Buddhism to Tibet, and that he, on a mythological level, is said to have visited many, many, many places in the Himalayas. Also on a historical level, is also said to have visited many places, many caves in the Himalayas. And if you visit any Buddhist place in the Himalayas, there will be probably one Guru Rinpoche holy site in that region. Whether it's a cave or a mountain or a footprint in the stone or a handprint, it can vary greatly. I do believe that Guru Rinpoche, on a historical level, very much passed by Langtang Valley, because if we look at old maps of trading routes between Lhasa and Kathmandu, that it follows the Trishuli River north, and the Trishuli River passes right by the Langtang River. And so that would have been the old historical salt trading route between Kathmandu, the Newars of Kathmandu, trading salt from Tibet, probably bringing things like tea and rice up to Tibet. And then they would follow the Sampo to Lhasa once you get up into the Tibetan plateau. So I think that's very likely the path that historical Padmasambhava Guru Rinpoche took, because if he's coming from Nalanda, then he's going to Kathmandu to visit Swayambhu Stupa, which would have been a very important holy site at the time. And then from Swayambhu Stupa, you just follow the river north and you get to Tibet. There are other narratives, depending, of course, where he's historically coming from. The path could vary, but it's likely that this is the path that he took.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's the case, then Langtang would actually be a very prominent example of a Beyul. Not only is it listed in Gödem Chen's guidebooks as a Beyul, but that there is a connection between an actual historical living Guru Rinpoche who visited these locations. Not to discount any other Beyuls, I mean, but I found that to be just interesting on my part.
So basically, from originally there is this notion of the land, the sacred land in Shambhala, according to the Kalacakra, and then Rigdzin Gödem, he reveals this dharma cycle where he has a list of Beyuls which were prophesied by Guru Rinpoche. But how are they related based on your research? These two, because these seem to be two distinct kind of pools of knowledge.
They are, particularly also because the Kalacakra Tantra would be used in a different kind of manner than these ideas of Beyul. So the Kalacakra Tantra could be interpreted as, this very heightened tantric visionary experience, visualizing this sort of like palace of the mind and then entering different layers of the mind to get to deeper and deeper levels. The Beyul is also visualized in similar fashion to that, but for a different purpose. So like when these guidebooks were being written, there was always a warning there. It was like in times of trouble, like when the invading armies come, when plague strikes, when problems arise, when the Dharma is in degeneration, seek out the hidden lands, and you can find them in these locations because these are prime, safe locations. And safety was something that was emphasized over and over and over again in these prophetic texts. So there's, different purposes for them. However, they're connected in the sense of how they are positioned in a mandalic fashion. So most people who are familiar with Tibetan Buddhism are very familiar with the Kalachakra mandala. This very distinct square mandala that has a kind of palace outline, and even monastery architecture is kind of shaped in a similar way to the Kalachakra mandala itself. The Beyuls are described in words in a literary fashion as being oriented in the same way. That you have this like 3-layered mandala, and those correspond not just to the physical location of the Beyul, but the Beyul is also a spiritual place in the mind, and only a realized master can see the Beyul, can like be present in the Beyul. And so in that sense, like we've all been in a Beyul. I mean, we are currently in a Beyul right now, but we have to just simply realize that and like kind of have the not just physical key, but the mental and spiritual keys to sort of unlock this pure vision way of seeing the environment, of not just a perfect place to meditate and become realized, but a place that is permeated by these deities and these spirits that are part of the environment. And then as part of the environment, they're also guardians of deeper teachings, whether they're water spirits, Nagas, Lu, or mountain spirits, Yulach, or there's a type of spirit in the Beyul called Temple, which is this warrior-like imperial spirit, and they're very wrathful and they guard things very dearly. And so treasure is hidden in the Beyul. And in the same way that there is a treasure hidden in Shambhala, this treasure of happiness, of paradise.
Can you explain a little bit about the different layers of the mandala within the Beyul as well?
So on the outermost layer would be the physical aspect of the Beyul. So the valley itself, the physical mandala itself, the trees, the mountains, the river, the people who inhabit it, the happy yaks who eat the grass up there, that would be the physical Beyul, as well as all of the medicinal plants that grow there, the yarsukumba that people harvest, the clean water from the glaciers. That's the outer layer.
Like the geomancy?
Pretty much. I mean, even the Mansi part, not so much, just the geographical part, the beautiful natural part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next layer in, you get to this kind of psychological layer where the Beyul represents more than just the geography. As is written in the guidebooks, it represents safety. It represents a perfect place for somebody to meditate. It represents a place of healing and abundance and prosperity. And it also represents a perfect place where the Yarlung dynasty, the original imperial dynasty of Tibet, can reestablish itself as political rulers of a reimagined Tibetan empire. And so part of that includes the creation of these mani stone walls that you'll see all throughout the Himalayas in Nepal that have Tibetan mantras written on them of Om Mani Padme Hum, Ah Shasa Maha, Om Ahom Badara Guru Pema Siddhi Hum. So these very common mantras within Tibetan Buddhism will be carved on the stones in the Beyul, which could be interpreted as sort of marking the boundary, the physical boundary of Tibet and the psychological boundary of the Tibetan cultural sphere. And then if we think about like how a mandala is oriented, on the boundaries of the mandala are demons. Like if we think about the image of the wheel of life, there's a kind of demonic Mara who's holding the wheel of life and he's guarding these boundaries. The Beyuls are visualized in the same manner in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries in Tibet as like these wild places where demons abide and they're very dangerous. And it could be, allegorical for the spirits that live there as well as the human beings who live there, because there are stories of Tibetans going into Sikkim and encountering local people who were not particularly happy about that and would kill them. So demons on the border, right? So yeah, this psychological element of the Beyul is like where one can go to like this mental space. There's a physical space and then there's a mental space.
The second level.
This is the second level. And then, of course, the third level, the deepest, the innermost sanctum of the mandala would correspond to this tantric envisioning, this sort of union of mental and geographical and spiritual, that it is both a land and a spiritscape that is inhabited not just by projected spirits of our, human symbolism, but that these spirits actually exist and they are agents of their own geography and guardianship of what they're supposed to do. In Tibetan, they call them trikyong, so like dharma protectors, right? And these dharma protectors they can be very, very dangerous, or they can be extremely beneficial if one is to follow the proper tantric protocol of interacting with these deities. And that in that as much, there are stories associated with it. So like, for example, in Langtang, if someone is walking along a cliffside path, and they nearly die, Like maybe there's a lightning strike or they feel like they were in mortal danger at that moment. There's a belief that part of their kind of shadow body gets like ripped apart. And this goes, I think, to pre-Buddhist times, from like kind of shamanistic time in the Himalayas. And that there was a ritual specialist called a lambu whose job it was to go into the spirit realm and find this part of their, I don't know if soul is the right word to use because that's a very Christian normative word. In Tibetan they call it la, which is like life force. And there are 9 parts of your la, of your life force. And if one is like ripped from your body, it creates extreme mental breakdown and sort of like something that should be in union has become disunioned and it needs to be put back together again. That's kind of how I think of the tantric field of a Beyul, is that you need to realize that there is already a union there. And when we are in that sort of disunion state of thinking that there is a separation between the physical and the mental and the spiritual, then we're in this kind of state of not fully understanding, of not fully realizing what the Beyul is. But only a realized master can really, really see that level. And this is what is described as kind of the pure vision experience of seeing the Beyul as it really, truly is, as this paradise physically, mentally, and dharmically, this dharma paradise where it's populated by all of these powerful deities that are Buddhists themselves. And then it has this royal vibe, like, oh, the Yarlun kings, the descendants of Trisong Detsen can reestablish themselves in this place and really bring Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan Empire back to its golden age.
So these being the textual, philological, or the theory
Yeah.
of how the Beyul should function,
Yeah, yeah.
etc. Based on your experience and your research, do you see some elements of these actually happening nowadays?
So nowadays we have a meeting ground of cultures. So in the Himalayas, tourism is pretty popular, and tourists from other parts of the world bring their own imaginings of what their own Himalayan paradise looks like. And for the Nepalis and Himalayan people, seemed quite open-minded to adopt some of these ideas as their own and embrace it as their own. For example, the Yeti. The Yeti is a mythology that was imported to Nepal by Westerners who were looking for this creature and trying to, identify it as a new animal or as a new creature, because the names that were used by locals would be different. Like Nepalis call it Banmanche, like the jungle man or something like that, which is a different iteration of what the Yeti might look like. In Pamang circles, they call it Banjakri, which is a kind of like witchy gnome hag kind of creature that's just like looking for her babies, and she'll capture people and keep them as her own and feed them like worms and slugs and snails. Anyway, so these Westerners bringing their ideas to Nepal were also adopted and embraced by Nepalis, of saying like, well, this is like our idea. This is really cool. Likewise, Shangri-La was also brought this idea that there is a hidden Himalayan kingdom called Shangri-La. Now, of course, it's not like this was foreign to Tibetans. I mean, and Himalayan people, this idea was created in the Himalayas, and that belief was also there. But the idea of seeking it out and locating it and getting to the physical location was something that we might see National Geographic explorers more keen to take a part in, rather than somebody from Langtang or Tsun Valley or Kathmandu even. So nowadays it sort of exists in this interaction between, what one person's fantasy of this place might be and another person's upbringing and cultural stories of this place or this location might be. And it's in flux. You can do a quick Google search of Nepal and it's like, come see the hidden Himalayan kingdom. This word hidden is used all the time, even though it's not hidden at all anymore. Or notions of, explorers looking for the physical location of Pemaka, for example, and being called the discoverers of Pemaka, when this has been known by Tibetan-speaking people for 500 years and it's been written in books. So there is an interaction happening and an embrace of foreign ideas happening, or maybe we could call it a conversation, a dialogical conversation. Dialectical conversation, that's the word.
What about from an emic perspective? What are the people living in these bayous aware that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. They're absolutely aware that it's Beyul. They'll,
How do they conceive of it?
as a happy place. So, Langtang, for example, its Beyul name is Namgo Dagan, which means the hidden land of half moon form. It's like a half moon shape. But the word Langtang itself means like the escape of the ox or the ox's run. And so the story goes back to pre-Buddhist times when, but it had been converted to a Buddhist story that Guru Rinpoche, in the form of an ox who was going to be slaughtered by the Tamang people living in this village called Bridim, in the opening part of Langtang, they were going to slaughter this ox, but it escaped and it ran up the valley. And the location where the ox stopped was the happy place. It was like this beautiful, flat, kind of grassy shelf on the valley, and the ox stopped there. It was eating the grass happy, and people saw it there. And they said, wow, this is the place to build Langtang village. And then the ox went further on down the valley, and the last mountain in Langtang Valley is called Langshisa, the place where the ox died. So you have Langtang and Langshisa, and it all kind of connects the valley in the sort of chronology of the life story of an ox, or a Guru Rinpoche in the form of an ox who ran and escaped. And we can see two geomorphological footprints in Langtang up in that area too. So yeah, the stories of the settling of these valleys, and not just in Langtang, but also in Tsung, in Solokhumbu, people are very well aware of the status of their, or I should say, the kind of religious status, the religious importance of these valleys in the Tibetan sphere.
Can you speak a little bit about the way these valleys were settled, like the migration pattern? How was it? Were these people who were settling influenced by the idea of Beyul?
Absolutely. So they would have definitely gone in that direction based on stories of Beyul
From Tibet?
from Tibet. So as far as I know, the evidence of settling of like Sherpa people, for example. So Sherpa means people from the east. And it's understood that these people are coming from Kham, and they're escaping war, primarily war and famine. At that time, the Dzungar Mongols were kind of rampaging through Tibet, attacking from the north, and there were groups of people attacking from the south. And in just Tibet,
I'm sorry, which time period?
this would have been
More or less.
late 1600s, early 1700s, that people would have been then escaping as refugees from this war torn, or maybe you could say as settlers, because they were going into wild places. These were wild, unsettled lands. Some places were inhabited previously, but other places weren't. And I mean, it would have been quite a journey at that time. I mean, you would have had to cross mountain passes up to 5,000 meters, maybe more altitude, thick, deep snow. And then when you get down into these valleys, you have to pass through like jungles, like thick jungles. You have to fight off predatory animals, leeches, and hordes of mosquitoes. It would have been rough. And in these guidebooks too, they refer to these, obstacles that they call it, the guardians of the Beyul, the blood-sucking leeches, the leopards, the mosquitoes. And like only if you have this pure vision and this ritual knowledge can you get past the protectors of, again, we run into this theme of it being pretty safe place. And so running away from war, you're going to want to go to a safe place that can be self-sustained.
Were they being guided by a tertön? Or
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, they would have. At least I know in the case of Langtang, there was a fellow named Rigdzin Gödem who was given a task by the king of Gungtang at the time. So this would have been early 1700s, around 1704, something like that, to locate the Beyul of Langtang. And so all they knew at the time was the name Namgo Dagam, and they knew that the mandalic positioning of where this Beyul should be, and that Yolmo should be to the south, and that Gungtang should be to the north, and that Nyingma should be to the east. And so if we look on a map, it's like, oh, well, that's Langtang. That's where it is. Like Yolmo's to the south and Gungtang is to the north. And so Rigdzin Gödem made that connection, and he went to that location. And there are stories that there were inhabitants in the valley prior to that, and they were Drukpa Kagyu people. Then they engage in some friendly Tibetan Buddhist debate. The Nyingmapas were victorious, and the rest is history. As, these stories tend to go. But the Beyul stories are very uniquely Nyingma. Not so, you don't see them so much in the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, Shambhala, certainly, yes, would be ubiquitous across Tibetan Buddhism, but the Beyul specifically would be unique to Nyingma. So yeah, early 1700s, we can see the settling of Solokhumbu, and then early to mid 1700s, we see the settlements of Nubri, Tsum, and Langtang happening.
All guided by a tertön, just people looking for a place to settle from the north.
Sometimes even employed by aristocracy to do so, and being given salaries to do so, and in resources
To the people were
to the tertön.
to the tertön.
Yeah, to the tertön. So,
Can you briefly say what is a tertön for anyone
Yep.
who's not familiar?
so a tertön would be a treasure revealer, right? So somebody who has the ritual knowledge and the education to access hidden teachings. And there are several kinds of termos. There's gongter, like mental treasures, and there are sater, like earth treasures that can be physically extracted from the earth itself. We can see temple paintings, for example, in places like Sikkim and Langtang and Sum and Mustang, where you see the act of a tertön reaching into a stone and taking a text out of the stone. And always behind the tertön is a female consort called a khandro. And so the khandro is kind of the like key. Or I should say, like, yeah, she's the gatekeeper. He is the key master, and only together can, to quote Ghostbusters, and if anyone see Ghostbusters, I am the keymaster. Are you the gatekeeper? Well, that's how the Beyul is opened as well. Um, yeah, so at least I know for sure that is the story of how Tsunmen and Langtang were opened, but I'm not familiar with the histories of like Nubri or the Beyul of Solokhumbu or Pemako, for example. I think is a little bit different because Pemako is not settled. It's more wild and very difficult to access. Yeah.
In a way, Pemako is the king of Beyul.
That's what
In a way.
some people say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's so difficult to access.
Yeah.
And it also is kind of this representation of the like Gyabyum, like the male-female counterparts of kind of tutelary deities, so like this family notion.
I read somewhere that that's the last place where the Dharma will remain in this time.
That's right. And so that was a prediction made by Gödem Chen in the
So it's
1400s. Yes. That because he is the original author of these so-called keys to the Beyuls. Pemako being one of them. Yeah.
And by the way, the Chinese government is trying to build a dam on the curve of the Brahmaputra
That's right.
at the moment. So
Yes, that famous curve there. Yeah. And there are ongoing projects all throughout the Himalayas that follow this pattern. And the Chinese model of new dams is to drill this enormous tunnel through like a curve in the river, and that the tunnel will slowly get smaller and smaller so that the water pressure will be like absolutely enormous when it's coming out the other end, and it will spin a turbine, which actually has less of an environmental impact than building a major dam. Also building a major dam in Nepali Himalayas or in that part of the Himalayas near the Yonam Tsangpo and the Brahmaputra. It's an incredibly seismically active region of the world. Now, what happens when you have an enormous dam burst due to an earthquake? You have a disaster far worse than the earthquake. In fact, we can see a natural phenomenon of that happening here in the Himalayas called Glacial Lake Outburst Floods, GLOF, which is just a terrifying prospect of basically like a tsunami on the land, like a wall of water coming down from a glacial moraine that has burst and released this torrential downpour. Last year there was one during the monsoon in the Barun region, I think. So, or was it in Kugu? I think somewhere around Everest region there was a glacial lake outburst flood last year, and it did tremendous damage. Luckily, it happened when most people were like at school or at work, so the village that was destroyed, not many people died, but if they were there, everyone died.
yeah, I was also in Rolbaling, which is one of the Beyuls prophesied by Rigdzin Gödem. And there's also a lake that is expected to burst at any time, but they build a dam and slowly they release the water to control
That's the idea, is to have like controlled releases of water.
Maybe you can also speak a little bit about the environmental relationship between Beyul
Right.
and
So that's kind of where we are now in our modern, or let's say contemporary view, or in Nepal's contemporary view of these Beyuls, as many of them have become national parks or conservation areas. Not all of them. There are some that aren't, but um, there is an emphasis from the Nepali government to conserve these areas. Um, and they're stewarded by local people who are put in charge of being the stewards of their sacred natural site. And a lot of tourism goes through there, but also there is some development projects that are um, dreamed up in these Beyul. And this kind of speaks to the Nepali vision of what vikas, of what development looks like. And the Nepali dream of a developed Nepal is a 100% hydropowered country, a country that has all of its energy coming from the enormous water resources that are here in Nepal, which are quite big for the amount of land area. And after the monsoon and during the spring thaw, when the ice and the snow is melting in the Himalayas, there is a lot of hydropower potential in this country. Of course, that would involve building huge development projects, infrastructural projects in sacred natural sites, which could damage the ecology. It can damage people's spiritual relationships with the valley. Um, Road building up there also makes them more accessible. So this idea of these lands being hidden is no longer a reality. They're very accessible. And I mean, one can only take a helicopter now. I mean, you can fly to the top of Tsum Valley in an hour on a helicopter from Kathmandu, maybe an hour and a half. Or it takes you, 8 days normally to walk up there through like crazy steep canyon that's like, 90-degree walls and like a road carved in there and then a river at the bottom. So accessibility in the Himalayas has increased a lot, which has also increased its, the environmental and ecological impacts of tourism, of development. And there is a back and forth between people who live there about how much to conserve and how much to develop. Because something like a micro hydropower, for example, that is prevalent in a lot of Himalayan communities. And micro hydropower we describe as something that is below 100 kilowatt hours of generation. And it's a small turbine, maybe something around the size of this room that we're in right now. And then you have a pipe, this kind of high pressure pipe coming from a glacial lake that feeds this, that can power maybe a village or two. It's not much, but it's very low impact ecologically. In fact, almost nothing. It's like zero, because it doesn't have any impact on like fish or any wildlife or anything like that. There's no flooding or damming that takes place. But with this new concept of drilling these tunnels through these mountains, it will have an enormous impact because fish, migratory fish who move up these rivers, which is kind of crazy to think that fish can swim up these insane rivers that if you've ever been there, it's like waterfalls, big boulders and like rushing waterfalls, and fish can swim up that, and they do to spawn. So if you build a tunnel like that, it will make it impossible for them to spawn. For example, with the village that is like the kind of trailhead to the Manaslu region here in Nepal, where you can go to Tsum Valley or Nubri Valley. It's called Machakola, Fish River. And the story is that there used to be so many fish in this water that you just reach your hands in there and you could grab fish out of the water with your bare hands. Now it's almost nothing. So yeah, there is a lot of talk about environmentalism, and also that Nepal is experiencing the impacts of global climate change and glacial recession at an accelerating rate, despite Nepal having no contribution to global climate change, right? So we see the disparity that the developed part of the world, which has caused, global climate change due to the release of carbon into our atmosphere, they're not going to see the most acute results of that, whereas mountain communities and island communities are going to see the worst impacts of it. We've already seen in your home country, Peru, the escape of glaciers entirely. Soon that will happen in the Himalayas. We know that it will happen. The question is that, what does that timeline look like? Is that 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? How much time do we have to prepare? So that seems to be the focus of people in these communities as well. Adaptation strategies, particularly about water resources. Because if the glacials glacial lakes become big and burst, then you don't have this repository of water. If the glacier itself disappears, then you don't have this permanent source of fresh water. Yeah, things are going to change a lot. I don't think it's an apocalyptic prognosis. It's not like these communities are going to leave. They're just going to stay there for sure. It just maybe certain Himalayan valleys are going to start to look a little bit more like Ladakh.
Mm-hmm.
But there are adaptation strategies as well. For example, a famous person named Dorji Wangchuk, he's building these ice stupas in Ladakh. Maybe you've heard of them.
A very cool idea.
And it's sort of a man-made permanent form of freshwater repository. And it's working. I mean, he's transformed a desert valley into a kind of like green oasis. And we can use this as a model for other places in the Himalayas as well. But of course, it needs to be cold. And if the world is heating up,
Yeah.
then what to do, yeah.
So going back from a Buddhist practitioner perspective, no? Is there any, the Beyul being a place also supposed to be a refuge for practitioners, in the Beyuls that you visited, are there people actually doing retreat, practicing? What's happening in that regard? I mean, you mentioned Minyu Rinpoche, but besides that?
It's not a lot. There are a few. I mean, of course, people that go on retreat want to find a place where there are not so many people, but there are some places that are more popular for retreat. Lapchi, for example, is like really serious practitioners go there and they can be very truly isolated. Langtang is a major tourist trekking trail, so you're not exactly isolated in Langtang unless you go past Kyanjin Gumba. If you go like up further towards Mingyur Rinpoche's cave, Langshisa, then you will find yourself in an environment that is entirely populated by wild yaks and wild mountain goats and maybe a snow leopard if you're lucky. That's pretty much it. Like, there's no human inhabitants up there. In summertime, they do have a ritual, but yeah, there's a few monks and nuns up in Langtang who reside in retreat. In Tsum, there are a number of people in retreat, and their location is kept kind of secret, probably for more their protection. And you can see remnants in Tsum Valley of these old Tibetan style, like beehive kind of places where people would wall themselves up for a 3-year retreat with just a single hole where they would reach a hand out to collect daily tsampa. And when you see what these places look like, it's like, wow, people lived in this small little beehive for 3 years and they would just meditate. So the historical locations are certainly there, with a little bit maybe more modern luxury, probably because of government safety stuff. After the earthquake, there was a lot of emphasis in these valleys to build things a little bit stronger to withstand earthquakes. So gompas are made out of cement now with rebar. In fact, it is the law now that buildings have to be built to some degree as earthquake resistant, which makes sense. Of course, if you're in a region that's prone to earthquakes and catastrophic landslides, you might want to build your house a little bit stronger, prevent some deaths and things like that. So yeah, retreats do happen, but if it's on a main tourist trekking trail, probably rarely.
Hmm. So that being the Beyul more from the Nyingma tertön tradition perspective, maybe we can go back to the Kalacakra.
Okay.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this, on whatever you know about the history of Kalacakra and the impact it has had? Wow, in what we're talking about.
Maybe we can kind of take like a little bit of a left turn because I'm not a scholar of the Kalacakra Tantra by any means, and my ignorance on the topic is vast. And it's a big topic. And I know that there are specialists out there that do study the Kalacakra Tantra in detail. But from what I know is that there was a time period, or maybe around the 9th and 10th centuries, that there was incursions from Muslim groups that were coming from the Abbasids and the Sassanids that were moving eastward and that were conquering lands or interacting with people in Central Asia. And around the time of, the 13th and 14th centuries, we see the rise of the Mongol, or the establishment of the Mongol Empire. And the Mongol Empire, it separated itself into different administrative districts, you might say. So there was like the main Mongol Empire, Mongolia, then there was the Golden Horde up in Russia, and like kind of into Europe, and then you had the Ilkhanate dynasty in the Middle East, and then you had the Yuan dynasty in China, unless I'm mistaken. I think it was that. And so that was, administered by a Mongol ruler. And so all of these places would kind of retain its culture and its religion, but they would just be administered by a Mongol ruler who would make sure that everyone was paying their taxes on time. The Mongols were big on tribute. Um, and it was also not uncommon for the Mongol ruler to convert to the local religion to kind of just, maybe as a, I don't want to say peace offering, but as a kind of way of encouraging mutual understanding and to make sure no rebellions or revolts took place. Sometimes people refer to this period as the Pax Mongolica, kind of similar to the Pax Romana, this 200 peacetime period, because it was administered by an enormous empire with a very strong military. And so during this time period, starting around 1250, we see a figure named Rashid al-Din. So Rashid al-Din was the vizier, the secretary, you might say, or the hand of the king, to use the Game of Thrones language. The vizier of Ghazan Khan. So Ghazan Khan was the Ilkhanid ruler of the Ilkhanid dynasty in the Middle East. So this includes Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Israel, Lebanon, all those Middle Eastern regions there. And he converted from the Mongol religion, so partial Tibetan Buddhism and Tengrism kind of mixed together, and he converted to Islam. And Rashid al-Din, he was born a Jew to an apothecary family, and he also converted to Islam and became the vizier of Ghazan Khan. Now, Rashid al-Din was given a very interesting task. He was given the task of writing a history of the Mongol Empire, of the rise of the Mongols to power, which he did very successfully. And it pleased Ghazan Khan and the court of the Ilkhanid dynasty so much that they said, great, we want more. We want now the history of the Mongols in Europe, in Asia, in North Africa, and even histories of the different religions that find themselves interacting in the Mongol Empire at large. And according to Johann Elverskog in his book Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road, they even offered Rashid al-Din like 1 million gold dinars as a reward for writing what is essentially the first world history, the world's first world history. I mean, maybe some people might say, okay, Herodotus wrote the first world history, but Herodotus wrote the first history of just the Mediterranean area of Persia and Greece and Egypt. But this, what is called the Compendium of Chronicles, the Jami al-Tariq, is an enormous text that talks about, not just the Mongols' rise of power, but the different religions in the Mongol Empire, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism. And Rashid al-Din does a really good job of representing Buddhism and making Buddhism somewhat palatable to an Islamic audience. So describing things in kind of theistic terms sometimes, but he also seems to want to understand Buddhism in Buddhist terms itself. So he interviews Buddhists, particularly Chinese Buddhists who are present in Iran, but also Tibetan Buddhists in the Afghanistan and Pakistan region, or people who would have been inspired by Tibetan Buddhism. So he describes Buddhism as being in 3 strands, of being the Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and Samyaka Buddhas. And so like this kind of like Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana distinction. And he describes it relatively accurately as well, which goes to show that he was not just collecting history, he was performing ethnography. So he was talking to people and taking their word as truth, which is very, very unique for somebody who is like an administrator of the world's largest land empire in history, and who is given the task of writing a history to like glorify the Mongols. And instead he makes it a kind of academic scholarly task to really truly understand all of the different components of the Mongol Empire. And so in this interaction, we can see that there is a lot of exchanges that have happened in Central Asia between Buddhists and Muslims, and that this happened very freely from both sides, and that Chinese Buddhists from East Coast China can travel all the way to central Iran peacefully, protected by the Mongol, rules of the Silk Road, and then they can interact with people there, speak local language or speak their own language and be understood. So this is why it's kind of as Pax Mongolica, right? And there's so many examples of exchanges that took place, particularly of the adoption of certain Buddhist or Indic things by the Muslim world. For instance, art. We see statuary being replicated in Muslim art, or we can see the incorporation of things like mandalas or the incorporation of things like stupas into Islamic art. Likewise, Islamic architecture was introduced into India, and so things like the Taj Mahal and our very famous imaginings of what Indian architecture looks like is really Persian architecture that has been transplanted into India and created its own Mughal thing, right? Other interactions include medicine, astrology, mathematics. And so one of my working theories right now is that this word paradise and this association of the word paradise with Shambhala, Shangri-La, and the Beyul is something that actually happened a long, long, long time ago, that possibly happened through this interaction between Buddhists and Muslims in the Silk Road in Central Asia. So paradise, the etymology of this English word paradise, but it's not just in English, it's also in all the Romance languages, Spanish, French, Portuguese, it's all the same. This comes from Greek, in the Romance languages, it's coming from Greek paradisos. But this Greek word comes from an even older Proto-Persian language called Avestan. And the original word is paridaitsa. Pari meaning perimeter, square, an enclosure of something, and daisa meaning like a space. But it had been reinterpreted in the Middle Eastern world to mean something like a garden. So all of our depictions of, let's say in the Abrahamic religions, of the Garden of Eden, we see a square, almost mandalic kind of positioning of this garden. Now in Arabic, the word for garden is Aden, Eden, which is where this kind of connection also is. And in early Islam, so from the death of Muhammad onwards to maybe the 9th, 10th centuries, I'm not sure about that, there was a belief that Jannah, or paradise or heaven in the Islamic faith, was Eden itself. And that Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise because they, committed the sin of eating of the tree. And that the faithful Muslims would be essentially reborn in Eden itself. And so some depictions of Eden is that it is this garden paradise that is surrounded by a geographical wall, surrounded by mountains. And so now we're starting to see this image of Shangri-La kind of emerging a little bit there. Now, of course, Shangri-La, Shambhala itself is indigenously Tibetan. There's no debate about that. But it's plausible that this notion of paradise being a place on earth, of being this place that we were once part of, but that it was taken away from us, and that we're striving to go back to this place, and that it is both inaccessible and accessible. It's like here on earth, but it's very far away. And we can see cognates of the word paradise in many, many languages in Asia as well. For example, in Nepal, Paradesh is a faraway land. In Sanskrit, you can also say things like that. Something that it's there, but it's almost inaccessible. Almost.
Like Paranirvana.
Exactly. Para meaning no, that's pari. Yeah. So para is like far away.
Also in Yolmo, one of the words, for example, as a Beyul is Gangirawa. Rawa is the enclosure as well.
Right. Yeah. Ra. I've heard like yomo ra or something like that. Yeah.
That's a enclosure idea.
Exactly. Enclosure. So we see the kind of repetition of some of these terms and these ideas that have existed especially in the Middle East for up to 5,000 years, as old as human civilization itself. Now, interestingly, in the past couple weeks, as I've been talking with friends and fellow Buddhists in Kathmandu about this idea, I faced some resistance to the notion that Buddhism has, or a very important aspect of Tibetan Buddhism specifically, has been influenced or adopted an Islamic idea.
Would you mention which aspects based on your research?
Well, so for instance, if, I were to say that, well, this notion of Shambhala being a paradise on earth, that this is coming from interactions between Buddhists and Muslims and may be rooted in Islamic, or we could say Abrahamic belief, is among some Buddhists rejected. But at the same time, if you say, oh, well, Islam has adopted certain Buddhist things, for example, the stupa imagery, the mandala imagery, certain astrological things, we can see the rise of Sufism happen because of the interactions between Shia Muslims and yogis in Kashmir. And so Sufism is kind of this sort of syncretic combination of Islam and yoga that happened during Islamic and Indic interactions. And it's very easy for people to see those connections that, oh, Islam adopted many Buddhist things, but then resistance to the idea that Buddhism is adopting Islamic things is maybe an obstacle that still needs to be overcome. Or maybe needs to be, on my part, I need to show more concrete evidence of something like this happening. It's difficult to find evidence because maybe these interactions are so subsumed into the culture itself now that it's difficult to parse through and see like, oh, it comes from here. And likewise, it's not so clear like that. Like human history doesn't happen like that, right? It's always interactions. There's always a dynamic interplay happening rather than like, oh, it comes from here and this comes from here.
Interdependent.
Exactly. Interdependence, indeed.
Daniel Matamara gave this lecture in which basically what I understood is that upon the Muslim conquest of some places,
Yeah.
particularly in nowadays Afghanistan and
Yeah.
Pakistan, the Bihar model of education was adopted into Islam, which in turn was
That's right.
absorbed into Europe, and that's where the modern university model.
It was like the architectural layout of a university. So if you look at like the oldest ruins of a vihara, yeah, it's kind of this square enclosure. You have different buildings for different purposes, like College of Economics, a college of, blah, blah, blah. Of course, not like that in the vihara itself, but organized in these different kind of buildings within a campus, let's say. And this notion was adopted by Muslim universities after the interactions in the Indic world and the conquests of the Indic world and the destruction of Nalanda, for example. And so that also speaks again to this narrative of what was Indic Muslim interactions. And it's always, at least from the Indic perspective, that the Muslims were the invaders and that they came in and they destroyed. That they destroyed Nalanda, they burned all of the Buddhist viharas to the ground, they committed atrocities, forced people to convert. Like, yes, that story is true on one instance, but that's not the entirety of Indic Muslim interactions. In fact, most of the interactions happen with trade, which would make sense. War is expensive. Trade makes money. People want to make money.
Nice logic.
Yeah. At least some people do, yeah. Maybe for the Mongols, war also meant making money.
Yes, yes. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Is that mostly what you're working on nowadays? What are your current research activities?
So looking more into, this kind of etymology of the word paradise. Also thinking about kind of the logic of what that means in different cultures, and that there are iterations of this idea of paradise in basically every culture, but it takes on slightly different form, whether it's a garden or it's the heavens or it's, whatever. It's quite interesting to me. So I'm researching more of that. I also was teaching a class last year called Buddhism and Development. So I'm looking into the notion of Buddhist economics, that is an entirely different conversation.
Could you briefly just summarize what?
Buddhist economics.
Very interesting.
Also, it's something that is really not spoken about a lot in Buddhism, of what to do with your money. Buddhists don't like to talk about money. In fact, it's a very secretive topic in Buddhism. Nevertheless, this is one of the strands of the Noble Eightfold Path, right? Livelihood was something that the Buddha himself taught about, and like what it means to follow a good path as a worldly person working in the world and trading and making money and raising a family and doing something for the benefit of society. It's something that is talked about at depth in Islamic law, for example. Like in the Hadith, there's a whole thing about what to do with usury and like scamming people and like for counterfeiting money and things like that, and punishments associated with certain economic crimes and benefits associated to certain things like generosity. But in Buddhism, there's only the abstract virtues and lofty ideals of the perfection of generosity and developing right livelihood. But what does that actually mean as living, breathing people nowadays? Because when I think about global climate change, when I think about, the disasters that are happening on our world today, a lot of it can be boiled down to economic disparities and the distribution of wealth and our acquisition of resources. I mean, if it weren't for our greed, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation to begin with. And if it weren't for our desire to acquire more power, and I mean electrical power in that sense, then we wouldn't be building these dams on the Yangtze River. The Chinese government would not be interested in doing that because they wouldn't need to power their factories. But it's not like it's going to disappear. It's not like we can get rid of capitalism. It seems that capitalism is here to stay, at least for the moment. However, we can establish adaptation strategies like people are doing in the Beyuls to prepare for the future. There's an ongoing project actually started by Kengboche Rinpoche, so the last abbot of Tengboche Monastery, and
Solo.
it was started in Solu, but now it's been adopted in several Himalayan valleys. It's called One Day, One Tree. And so the idea is that villagers up in these valleys will, on a certain specified day, probably agreed to by the head lamas, everyone will go and plant one tree. One tree, one day, you plant these trees, and you plant trees that are good at retaining water. So things like beech or birch trees are really good at retaining water, with the idea that in the future, when the ice caps melt, when they are gone, there will be a forest there to be the source of water retainment. This is a long-term strategy, of course.
Is it being implemented?
It is on a very limited scale, but I think as things become a little bit more dire, I think this will accelerate because it's easy to do, or I should say relatively easy to do compared to like building a big project. To get building supplies up in these high altitude places, I'm sure you've seen yourself, it's quite an ordeal. Donkey trains that are hundreds of donkeys long bringing cement. Sometimes they have to lift by helicopter big pipes and stuff up there. And it's really expensive just for even like a, relatively small project of like piping water to a micro hydropower plant could cost tens of thousands of dollars just to bring the supplies up there, not including the cost of the supplies itself. So yeah, there are ongoing things. There are private groups, NGO groups that are involved in educating people, preparing them with adaptation strategies, interviewing people and getting their opinions because, these people who live up there, they know what their environment is like. They know when the planting seasons are and what to do. And so we need their knowledge in order to make proper adaptation strategies. Otherwise, it's just going to end up like what happened when the British decided to, segment the Middle East.
Or India?
Like this one is Iraq, this one is Israel, this one is Jordan. And look where we are now.
Or Africa?
Exactly. Or Africa, or India. Yeah, yeah.
It always goes back to that fucking British Empire, doesn't it? Yeah. Yet here we are speaking English.
Yeah, here we are speaking English. Indeed. How are we doing on time? I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
No, this is great.
Been 1 hour exactly?
A little more. So here we are sitting with Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche.
Yes.
I don't know if the camera still works. Yes. So Tulku Urgyen, we Andy and I were saying how because of Kukurjin we're here talking right now. We met
Right.
through his interdependence.
That's right. Through his son, Choginim Rinpoche.
Rinpoche. And is there anything else you'd like to say, Andy?
That's it for now. Yeah, maybe we can talk again sometime in the future.
Yeah, we'll continue to see what's happening research-wise.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you.
this talk and giving me the opportunity to geek out about something that I like.
Okay, sure. We geek out a lot in Amsterdam, actually.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Maybe we should also say hello to our friend Ram.
Yeah. Hi, Ram.
Or Musti.
Namaste, Ji.
So yeah, I guess that's it for now. Thank you, Arodia and Rachel, who are here with us.
We have an audience.
There was a small audience.
Yeah.
We are at Arodia's shop, Rupa Maker. We'll put a link in the description. Please come and get some cool statues, such as two Guardians. I also organize tours of Nepal, and if you want to visit a Beyul, I'm going to put my website in the description. If you have any contact you want to share, you can share it and I'll add it in the description.
Buddhist view, right?
Buddhist view for
Buddhist.
Vinegar. I'll put that on his website. Rachel, if you want to say something, you can put it there also. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Yeah, it was nice.
So, yeah. Namaste.
Namaste.
Okay, that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
That was fun.